Hi, my name is DelmarshaeWalker. Welcome to my channel. I hope everyone is having a great day today. What I want to talk about is the ideology construct of the terminology race, which does not exist. Race was created in order to classify groups of people based on their similarities. If you go back to slavery time and you look at black people, we used to be called niggers. That was to classify us as being different from white people. Little black children during those times was called pickaninny. Then once slavery was over, we went from being called niggers to being called colored. Then our classification changed to Negroes. Then at some point we landed on black. Then black people want to be reclassified as African Americans. So right now some people say black, some people say African American, so those two are interchanged. But those are just classification construct to keep people separate. The whites over here, the blacks, African Americans over there. The reason that this was created, initially, people immigrated into this country, and black people and white people from different countries, from Africa, from Europe, from Ireland, wherever, they just came to America looking for a better life. And they all worked together as indentured service. Yes, there were some slaves back then, but not to the level it ended up being. So a lot of black people, as well as other people from the other countries, came over here as indentured servers to pay for their trip to America. Once their time was over, they was allowed to go out, they got land, and then they was able to, work for themselves and create a lifestyle for themselves here in America. Then it got to a point where so many people was coming over, they started running out of land to give people. So with the poor people, the working class people, they started to revolt against the rich, against the upper class people, the elites. So because of that, there was more poor people than there was rich people. So the black people, the white people that was poor, based on the countries that they came from, because like I said, race wasn't a terminology used back then. So they was, just commingling together. They was working class, they was poor, and they were revolting. The richer upper class people, it was rich against poor. So they was afraid that eventually the poor people would take over because it was more poor people than it was rich people. So what they had to do is come up with a way to change that. And so that's where classification came up, and they said, okay, we're going to get the poor people on our side that look like us by saying, hey, we're white just like you're white, so you should be on our side and not on their side. Look at them, they're black. So that's where the whole race thing came about, and that's how it started separating between the white race and the black race. It was really about the rich people not wanting to lose their standards as far as being rich, and it was all done from an economic place, an economic stand. And so I have a video that I would like to share with you.
1. There was a labor shortage. The flow of indentured workers had started to slow significantly, and as a result, landholders began to turn to an increased slave population. 2. Conditions between both indentured servants and slaves became much more harsh. For servants, even a minor infraction would increase the term of a labor contract, sometimes for years. And even when those labor contracts were up, there was little or no land available to be granted them as per their contract. Because at this point, most of the land was either taken over by friends of the king or the wealthy elite. 3. Tobacco prices fell as the number of farms producing it increased, which caused the local economy to suffer and worsen the living conditions in the colonies. While it's true that slaves were clearly at the bottom of the totem pole, the living conditions for poor servants had also become severe. 4. In 1670, a law was passed that removed a vote from anyone who did not own land, further restricting newly freed laborers from changing policies that might discriminate against them. And 5. Along comes a man named Nathaniel Bacon, who united these groups to fight back. Now, Bacon was no saint. As a white landowner, he had his own agenda, and in 1675, Bacon developed a plan to take land from several Native American tribes in the area in order to acquire land for himself and his supporters. But the ruling class refused to allow their militia to help attack the Native American population. In retaliation, Bacon began a public campaign against the wealthy and criticized their treatment of the poor. He convinced some small landowners to join him. He demanded an end to slavery and made false promises of amnesty to slaves. And then, finally, after a year of planning and building a coalition, Bacon united the servants, slaves, and the poor landowners against the wealthy elite and Governor William Berkeley. On September 19, 1676, Bacon and his coalition burned the colonial capital of Jamestown to the ground. Governor Berkeley fled across the river. Later, he returned with a fresh contingent of British troops and took back the city. Some of Bacon's followers were hanged, but Bacon himself died of dysentery before Berkeley regained the city. So why are we talking about a class uprising? Well, because these events changed everything. The rebellion scared the hell out of the wealthy elite, and the first thing they did was to begin phasing out the use of servants and began recruiting slaves from deeper in Africa who had no experience with the English language. This prevented effective communication or resistance. But still fearful, the wealthy elite and local lawmakers relied upon a divide and conquer approach. Over the next few decades, they passed a series of laws that created categorical differences for all new colonists. Those laborers of European origins were given more privileges and rights than those laborers of African descent. This later came to be known as a racial bribe. Servants' contracts were now honored, and they were insured land at the end of their terms. In 1681, we see the very first law that creates the categories of white and black to mark the distinction between the two populations. In the decades that followed, many laws were created. Free blacks were no longer allowed to hold office. Their right to vote was removed. Blacks were no longer allowed to testify in courts against whites. Blacks were no longer allowed to possess weapons. Blacks could receive public lashings for raising a hand against any white person. And over time, most free blacks found themselves in slavery as a result of minor legal infractions. On the other side, free whites were granted greater access to Native American lands. White servants were allowed to police slaves, and barriers were created between the areas where they had previously cohabitated. This gave the poor whites a perceived stake in the control of the colonies. Though their conditions did not actually change much, the wealthy elite had convinced them that it had through the creation of the categories of black and white. Through this, the concept of race was born, and it was born for the specific purpose of controlling the poor. In other words, the concept of race was born as a tool of class control. I should note, in many ways, this hasn't gone away, but we'll talk about that in another episode. By the 1750s, there was a culture born in the colonies and in Europe that fostered the idea of racial superiority. White supremacy was born.
And we're more or less still in that same situation where it's like the rich, the elites, they're still playing the game of being puppet masters. And as long as they're being puppet masters, they're confusing everyone. So everybody who has a certain economic, are considered poor, they're fighting amongst themselves. You have black and white people fighting against each other. You have Democrats and Republicans fighting against each other. With the Roe versus Wade, you have pro-life and pro-choice fighting against each other. You have all this divide going on in the world to keep everyone focused on like these little fires that's going on everywhere. So you're more focused on that instead of what's going on in the world of the elites, what their true agenda is. And so as long as they can keep you off balance, as long as they can keep you focused on other things, you're not going to be really worried about them, because you're just going to be more or less in your bubble, worry about what's going on around you. That's understandable, and that's how they want to keep everyone. So instead of us being divided, because if we're in the trenches together, we should be allies and not enemies. We should be working together to solve these problems that they're actually creating. They're creating these problems to keep you divided. So it's like the upper echelons of the elites. Then you have the people kind of like in the middle, and then you have poor people. And the people that's kind of like in the middle, they want to be liked by the elites. So it's a lot of things they do to kind of keep everything stirred up, keep everyone kind of off balance. So we need to stop fighting each other and start working together to solve the problems and really see, the mind games and the divisions they're trying to have amongst people. So that's basically all I wanted to say. I hope everyone is having a great day. Peace.